I will be saying subscribe at least 1,000 times in this video. So, should you subscribe now or subscribe later? Do whatever you want if you want to subscribe, so you can subscribe to my channel. Hopefully you can subscribe later on or subscribe now. Let's just see. If you can subscribe now, maybe you will not need to hear me say subscribe like 900 more times. Somewhere around there. Subscribe for me to grow, so I can actually get better content up. So better start subscribing. Subscribe. I better go on Toilet Tower Defense subscribe. You know what? I'll go in Blade Ball subscribe. I press the subscribe button. Subscribe. Oh, this guy looks like he'll subscribe to me. Subscribe. Oh, I better hit that subscribe button. Oh, you look like you want to subscribe to me, right? I don't know where I am. Please subscribe. It's subscribing late. Why is it subscribing late? Bop. Subscribe. See, if you don't subscribe, you'll end up like that guy in every Blade Ball game you play. I'm joking. He hasn't subscribed either. Jeez, how many non-subscribers are in this match? Subscribe. See, that person didn't subscribe either. And subscribe. Subscribe. Oh, shoot, easy. Subscribe. Easy, subscribe. That was so easy. You should subscribe now. Well, you can, of course. So, subscribe to grow. Subscribe for every YouTube channel. Subscribe so Mr. Beast can beat T-Series. Oh my god, you look like you want to hit the subscribe button. You just hit it. Nice. Subscribe. I will beat you. Huh? What is this? Subscribe. Subscribe, man. Subscribe. Hit subscribe. Hit the subscribe button while I'm hitting the ball. Subscribe. Yeah, subscribe. And subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Oh no. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Please subscribe. Scrub sign. Sub. Subscribe. I think I just naturally said it over 1,000 times. No! Subscribe. Subscribe like I'll hit the ball. Subscribe. Are you kidding me? Subscribe. That was unfair. Subscribe now. Subscribe. Subscribe. Yeah, he didn't subscribe, so that's what happened to him. You were supposed to subscribe. 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 You know it's good for you. You know to subscribe all of the time. Subscribe. 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 Easy. He didn't subscribe, so our team won. Yeah. You should subscribe right now before you die in Blade Ball. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe. I've been saying subscribe for quite a while. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. You know to subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe. You know it, bum. You know to subscribe. Unlike some people, only some people can subscribe right now. Hit that little subscribe button. Subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe. I have the subscribe. 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 Hit it, subscriber. Subscribe. 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 Yeah! Subscribe team wins. Yeah. If I knew how to edit, I'd turn that thing to a subscribe button. Like, for blue team wins, I'd put subscribe wins. Subscribe team wins. Subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. 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 For some reason, I keep on winning. Subscribe. Subscribe. Yeah, you want a subscriber? So that's what's going to happen. Subscribe. See? You non-subscribers? Subscribe! How many people aren't? And subscribe. 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 Sub. Yeah! Yeah! Subscribe! Oh my god, I'm so good today. Subscribe. Subscribe. Yeah. Subscribe. Subscribe with notifications so you can subscribe. Subscribe with notifications so you know when my newest video comes out. How? I died right after. Huh? Subscribe. You know to sub. Subscribe. You know to sub. Subscribe. You know to sub. Subscribe. What the? Subscribe. Subscribe for good content with notifications. Woohoo! Subscribe with notifications. Woohoo! Subscribe with notifications on. Woohoo! Subscribe with notifications. I believe I said subscribe more than 1,000 times in this video. So subscribe. I will say it as many times as this video lasts for. Subscribe. Hey, subscribe. You still didn't subscribe? How dare you? Subscribe. Subscribe now for good content. Subscribe. Subscribe. Come on, subscribe. I need as much help so people can subscribe with notifications on. Subscribe. Subscribe to Mr. Beast too. Subscribe. Subscribe to him too. Subscribe to Mr. Beast. He is the only beast. Subscribe to me too. I have good content too. Are you kidding me? Subscribe! You made me lose that one because you didn't subscribe yet. Come on, subscribe already. Subscribe! Subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I said it probably over 10,000 times. I don't know. So all I know is I said it a lot. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. If anyone is willing to watch this and watch the how many times I said subscribe in this video, please comment the amount of times I said subscribe. So finally people can subscribe. And subscribe. 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 Subscribe with notifications on, so you know whenever I post a video. And subscribe. And maybe subscribe. 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 Yeah, you need to subscribe. And subscribe. 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 Yeah, subscribe. And subscribe. 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 You didn't subscribe that much either. My subscribe luck is going down. Subscribe, 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 sub also counts as subscribe. Sub. How come I'm really good now? Subscribe with notifications on, so you don't miss any future videos. Subscribe. And I post daily, basically. And subscribe with notifications on. You know it's good to do that. Subscribe. Subscribe with notifications on. Subscribe. Okay, I need as many people to subscribe in the next 5 minutes. You know what? 2 minutes. Come on, subscribe. 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 Unsubscribe. Subscribe maybe? Come on, subscribe with notifications on. Come on, you'll know whenever my newest video comes out. And I want you guys to know when my newest video comes out so you can subscribe to it. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Come on. Ooh, I'm going to equip this. Subscribe. Subscribe with notifications on. Make sure to subscribe. Subscribe so you can be happy with my videos. And leave a comment so I know what you guys like. Subscribe. Subscribe, share, subscribe, 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 subscribe. What? It was subscribing me out. What the subscribe? What the subscribe? Subscribe with notifications on. Make sure you don't miss my next video. Subscribe, subscribe. Help! Help me! Oh wait, subscribe. See, subscribing does help. Oh my god, this guy will not help me subscribe. Well, he's not wanting people to subscribe. Don't listen to him. Subscribe anyways. Even if you don't like my content, I can't say everything. Oh. How is that fair? If you don't subscribe, then bad things will happen. Well, not bad things will happen, though you just want to subscribe. Are you kidding me? You guys didn't subscribe, so we couldn't finish that subscribe battle. He needs to die so I can finally hit my dream of 10,000 subscribers. Well, basically 100,000 because it would thus be a milestone. That's why I'm doing this video, asking people to subscribe. Subscribe! Subscribe to help this guy win. Oh, you guys didn't help him to win. Oh my god, I thought my recording almost was done, so you guys almost can subscribe there. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Very good, just subscribe. It's good to subscribe right now because, I don't know, fun to make some of these. Subscribe for more awesome content like how I make. Subscribe or that person will lose. Well, subscribe for me to win. Subscribe. 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 Nice. Double eliminations. That means that person didn't subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Sometimes when I'm just saying this for too long, well, it hasn't been happening to me lately, though, if I say subscribe too many times, then I'll forget how to say it. So, subscribe with notifications. Subscribe with the notifications. Subscribe. 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 Nice. Subscribe. 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 Nice! You guys subscribed so I could win. Nice. Yay! How many wins do I have anyway? I have 9? I've been thus winning. Thank you guys for subscribing. Subscribe without notifications on subscribe. Earlier I thought I was dead for... Darn it, I died. Subscribe. Guess you guys didn't subscribe that round. Then maybe you guys can subscribe to the next round. Freeze ball. I actually have no idea how many ones I have. Oh! Subscribe. No, my thing's out of control. Oh wait, there we go. Maybe you guys can subscribe so that will never happen to me again. Subscribe. I'm about to go full subscriber power. And sub. Oh my god, that guy died in an instant. Subscribe to revive him in the next game. Subscribe. And where's my next subscribe? Holy. Subscribe. Oh my god, she didn't see that coming. Subscribe. Easy! How come I'm so good now? Subscribe. 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 I'm going to say subscribe even more now. Subscribe. You want... Jeez, that attack was fast. I have over 90 kills. Subscribe. One most wins. One most eliminations. Oh, nice. Make sure to subscribe though. Subscribe. You know what? I'm going to pretend I am this guy. You know what? I'm going to... Nice! 1x1. Make sure to subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. I'm going to put a subscribe logo on this video. Subscribe. So this guy won't pop out in your room tonight. And where is it? I say subscribe. 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 Oh my God, subscribe. No, we need to start subscribing him so he can lose lots of HP. Bob. Jeez. Subscribe. Subscribe. Oh my God. I thought I was almost dead. Subscribe. Hey. Subscribe. 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 He blew me to smithereens. Subscribe. 2 people are alive, that's good. Just a second. Subscribe. No one won, are you joking? Subscribe, 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 subscribe. So we can finally beat that boss guy. I'm not ending this video until we beat that boss guy. Subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. And I need like 300 more coins for that freeze ability, so subscribe. Subscribe! Subscribe so I don't lose this, so I can finally get that cool ice ability thing. Subscribe! Subscribe! Looks like that person didn't subscribe. Subscribe. Yeah! Subscribe. 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 Yes! No! You guys didn't subscribe so I can win that. Subscribe for this mode. Subscribe for this mode. You guys subscribed. Nice. And ready to die, you unsubscribers. Subscribe. 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 Sub. 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 Oh my God. That person's hacking. So, subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Sub. No! I died because my shield ran out of standoff? I didn't know we were standing in this tournament. Subscribe! Subscribe for the green map. It looks like you guys subscribe. Nice. Subscribe. Subscribe. Oh my god. Subscribe. Don't fear, that person was like right behind me. You know what? I'm going to end this subscribing journey. So please subscribe for my videos to be much better and longer or shorter. Subscribe.